Okay, so we've been asked to share routes on router 4 between CE1 and CE2, so it's just a local sharing. And remember, of course, that even though it's CE1 and CE2, sometimes in our commands we'll be using C1 and C2, but it is CE1 and CE2 that we're sharing. So we're going to be using rib groups to move the routes from one VRF to another VRF. So let's have a look at our rib group. Well, here's the first one. It's C1 C2 VPN. Obviously import rib. Here's the first table, C1 INET, and the other table, C2 INET. And we're going to be placing that in two locations. The first place that we're going to be putting it is on the protocol's OSPF inside the routing instance C1. So protocol's OSPF, rib group, INET, C1 C2 VPN, and of course any route that the OSPF was placing in C1 INET, it will duplicate and place in C2 INET. Now the second place that we're going to be putting these routes is on the interface routes, and this is really important because the first set of routes need to resolve, and they need to resolve on the PECE interfaces, so those routes have to go across as well. So here we have the rib group, and we're placing it on set routing instances C1, routing options, interface routes, rib group, INET, and then the rib group. Now notice here also that if we were doing policy option policy statement, we would use the term direct, but on rib groups, we go into routing options and we use the term interface routes. So that moves the routes from the C1 into the C2. Now we need to move the routes the other direction. So our second rib group, set routing options, rib groups, C2 C1 VPN, import rib, C2 INET, C1 INET. So this is also going to be attached in two locations. First, we're going to go into the C2 spoke, protocols BGP, family INET unicast, and then attach the rib group C2 C1 VPN. And of course, we also have to go into the interface routes, because these routes here that BGP are moving from the C2 INET or duplicating into the C1 INET, they'll be resolving on the PECEs. They're resolving on those interface routes. So we have to go into C2 spoke, routing options, interface routes, rib group, INET, C2 C1 VPN. And notice again that if we were doing a policy option policy statement, we would use direct. However, when we're attaching rib groups, we have to use the interface routes. And these interface routes, not only are they inside the routing options, but they're inside the spoke. So our next requirement is that once the routes are shared on router 4 between CE2 and CE1, that CE1 doesn't send that out further, and that CE2 doesn't also export that out further as well. They're just being shared on router 4. Now, the issue with this is that as the routes went from C1 to C2 from the interfaces, they landed in C2 as effectively directly connected routes. Now, C1 had a very, very basic VRF target inside the routing instance, and of course it scooped them up and it exported them out. So the way that we're going to stop that is that we're going to remove the basic target in C1. We're going to replace it with VRF export and VRF import so that we can actually control what gets exported and imported. We're going to use a really simple technique here. What we're going to do is on the export from the protocol direct, we're going to only export the PECE connections that are natively in C1. So, so when those PECE connections disappear from the export into the layer 3 BGP VPN, the routes become unresolvable, the ones that have moved from C2 to C1. So a bit complicated, but we had to move those directly connected routes so that router 4 could use it themselves. However, on the export, if we prevent those directs from coming out by specifying only the native ones inside inside C1, then we can prevent it from going further. So configured very simply, C1 VPN export from protocol direct, and we're nailing down the locally connected ones here. Community set CE1 accept, and then from protocol OSPF set CE1 accept, and all the rest are rejected. and that will prevent those routes from bouncing further from that direction. Now the other direction, going from C1 to C2, C2 of course is our hub and spoke. We can see it here in the pink, and that's using VRF import and export. So we won't have such drastic work to remove a VRF target, but we will need to nail down those directs by the actual interfaces, the PEC interfaces, or a single interface in this case, on router 4. Okay, so here are the rework terms. We've reworked them a little bit, reordered them. Set policy options, policy statement, C2 spoke export, term 1 from protocol direct, and we nail down the specific directs and the loopback, and then term 2 from protocol BGP, then community set C2 spoke, then community add C2S2 origin, because of course we need that origin on there as well, and then accept. And that actually prevents the routes from being spread further, because of course you only have that single PEC interface. Of course you have the loopback here as well, and without the directly connected PEC connections from the CE1-3 on R4, the routes won't resolve, and we don't need to worry about the other CE1 routes going further.